Thank you so much for joining us. Can everybody hear me okay? Awesome. So I'm Yvonne Gando, and as Jeff mentioned, today we'll be talking about the critical importance between writing and research in our product development cycle. But before we delve into that, I want to go ahead and talk about how our partnership started, because we get those questions a lot. And so it was kind of an organic process. So Seth and I used to be on the same team on Google+. And so he'd have a question often about UX writing, and I'd have a question about research. And like over time, we found that each of us were super curious about the other's discipline. And we found that so many projects had a wonderful opportunity to collaborate. So we went ahead and captured and codified our learnings and insights. And we had the opportunity to present our learnings to the broader UX community at Google. And we were so happy that it was well received. Later on, we decided to develop the content into a course. So at Google, we have this wonderful opportunity to have Googler-to-Googler led courses where we can teach any skill or craft. So Seth and I embarked on teaching this like every single month, and we got a 5 out of 5 star rating, and we're super excited about that. And we got a broader reach of like over 30,000 Googlers who had the opportunity to take the course. So today, we're super excited to share these learnings with you in the hope that you might be able to take some of these techniques and tools and methods and apply them to your own work when you're back home.
So today, before we dive into the crux of the presentation today, the first thing we want to cover today is the importance of collaboration between the discipline of UX research and the discipline of UX writing. And I've been in the profession of, I'm a UX researcher, Yvonne is a UX writer, and I've been in this profession for the last 8 years, being at Microsoft before and then doing a short stint at Nordstrom and now at Google. But to my surprise, I haven't seen this relationship being very common across these different kinds of industries. So when we started on this, we thought, oh, this is just organic and this should be happening all the time. But then when I looked at my past career and everything, we didn't see that was happening a lot. So the first part of the presentation will go really deep into the importance of collaboration between writing and research. The crux of the talk is really about, as Jeff was mentioning, that how have we employed UX research methods to come up with text which is more user-informed than not being more user-informed, and come up with writing which is more objective than it is more subjective. And then we have a key takeaway for you, and we'll discuss that later as we go along.
So I want to go ahead and start off with a quote by Malcolm Gladwell. We as human beings have a storytelling problem. We're a bit too quick to come up with explanations for things we really don't have an explanation for. So imagine this, you're in a conference room Tuesday morning and people are throwing around ideas, and there's so many great ideas in the room, ideas become these assumptions, and somehow along the way these assumptions make their way into a feature, into your product. So this happens far too often, at least in our space. And so we thought, this is a problem because we're not really relying on user-informed problems and solutions that then solve those problems. We're relying on these assumptions that we think are important. So how do we even solve this? So how many of you here are UX writers or have worked with a UX writer? Awesome. Oh, that's so exciting. So as many of you know, as craft practitioners, you have certain elements that you've codified and captured as consistent standards like best practices and voice and tone guides, vocabulary lists that are particular to your actual product area. And then when you go and apply these techniques and these principled kind of theories to your product, there's a bit of subjectivity that inevitably has to creep in, and that's due to several iterations and business requirements and stakeholders' eyes. So how can we then mitigate this subjectivity and really try to figure out how to become more closer to user-informed text?
So just to go on with that example, like how Yvonne was talking about, the subjectivity creeps in as and when you're trying to take these underlying principles and trying to come up with something which is called a UX text at the end of the day, which shows up in a variety of places in UX. Let me stop by and sort of give you an example. I stole this slide from a Medium article, and there's a link at the end of the slide which you can go and visit. But let's imagine that you are an associate at a hardware store, right? and a customer walks in, and you ask the customer, hey, what are you trying to do? And the customer tells you that I'm trying to build a fence. So at that point, you ask them, why are you trying to build a fence? Or even before you ask them the why, what if you were not to understand why they're trying to build a fence, you would go here, like, oh my God, this customer is trying to buy a fence, and you will take them to the fence shelf or something. Oh, sorry. Yes. You will take them to the fence shelf, and you'll try to show them all the amazing fences which are there, and like you'll this is plastic, and this is metal, and this is blah blah blah, and this is this device defies gravity, and this has like gold melded in, like, right? Like you'll try to tell them all the things which are there in the fence, and the customer is just like standing there and like, I don't care about any of these features. Would you be able to sell the fence to them? Probably not, right? But if you take a second and you ask the person, like, hey, why are you trying to buy a fence? And they'll say, hey, to surround my front yard. And like, hey, why are you trying to surround your front yard? And they'll say, hey, to plant a garden. Why do you want to plant a garden? And then the customer will say, to grow my own food. Why do you want to grow your own food? To save money in groceries. So obviously, this is an extreme example of what I'm trying to characterize, but you can get a sense that if you ask why enough times, you can get to the actual user need on what people are trying to do and why, more importantly, why people are trying to do what people are trying to do, and build off of that core user need, in this case, which is to save money, right, on groceries. And so take a second, and now let's imagine that if you were UX designers and UX writers and UX researchers, and you're trying to build a solution for the product team on a user need, and you had the first user need, which is I want to build a fence, versus if you had the last user need to save money in groceries, what are the different types of solutions you will come up with based on the two different types of user needs you have? Right? So the first one will be like, hey, these are all the fences, blah, blah, blah. And this last one would be, hey, you want to try, you're trying to save money in groceries, go and buy this fence, or something like that, right? So understanding the right user need is super critical and super important in just the development of products these days. And I just want to emphasize the fact that getting to the heart of the user need is super important. So how do we fix this problem? So I wish it was more fancy and more fanciful of an answer, but at the end of the day, it all starts with people. And you may call them subjects, you may call them participants, and you may call them people who are coming into the lab and blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, they're all human beings, and what we have as a responsibility as UX practitioners is to include them in the product development process and include their feedback while we are developing the products, as opposed to when we're done developing the products and saying, hey, here you go and test the products with these users who we are going to design for. So it all starts with people, and make sure that you're including them in the process of the product development phase, so that we are getting their feedback throughout the product development, as opposed to getting the feedback at the end of the day. So we know the problem. We understand that it starts with people. So now what? So what do we do about this? So when we do incorporate user feedback into the product development process, which is the whole sort of premise of user-centered design, it's not rocket science what I've just talked about. It's this sort of premise of UCD. So now what? So what happens is, what we end up shipping at the end of the day is not design, it's not visual design, it's not just interaction design, it's not just UX writing, it is user-informed text, it's user-informed design, and we can call it word design, we can call it visual design, but at the end of the day, we're not just shipping hypotheses, we're not just shipping opinions and assumptions, we're shipping things which we have validated through user needs and behaviors and motivations and intents and values. So that is what the whole importance of partnering with writing is, that when we were, like Yvonne and I were not partnering before, the text used to show up in the designs in these meetings, and we used to have like all these random discussions in the meeting, like, hey, what do you think about this text? And what do you think about that text? And people used to go around the room and like ask each other's opinions about the text. And at the end of the day, they're like, hey, Seth, what do you think? And I used to say, I don't care about anyone and what you think in this room. What I care about is what people who are actually going to use the product, what they think. And let's go outside and let's get their feedback and let's ship something which we all believe is a fact and not an opinion at the end of the day. So that is sort of the whole crux of the first part of the presentation, which is like understanding and making sure that users are involved in the process of product development is super important. What we are going to talk about now is that how we have used some of the research methods and have used the research methods to inform specifically text in this case. I have been a researcher for a while, so we have been using a lot of research methods to inform design. But in this case today, we are going to talk about how the importance of research and writing has grown in Google and how we have been doing things. So we are going to talk about, I think, about 5 or 6 different research methods. And the first one, we're going to talk about rapid iterative testing and evaluation. How many of you are familiar with this method? That is amazing. Thank you. So basically, if, as all of you know, write is a slight variation of a traditional usability study, where, as the name denotes, it's rapid iterative testing and evaluation. It's sort of a lean UX methodology, which enables the team to make rapid iterations on a piece of UI, on a piece of text. And the key difference between a write method and a usability method is that we are able to make changes within the participants. Like, for example, if the first participant comes in and we see a very obvious error, we are able to make changes to the design before the next participant comes in, as opposed to in a usability study where we wait for all the participants, like 5 or 6 participants, and then go and make the change and then do another study. So this way, this is rapid and it helps us move the product forward much faster.
So this is one example of how we use the write method. And so this is about me at Google. So this is an identity layer that cuts across all of Google products where people can edit their personal information. So what's important about this to note is that before this product, everybody had different fragmented pieces of their identity across the Google ecosystem, whether it was Gmail or G+, or Drive. So we wanted to make sure that there was one centralized way for people to go ahead and edit this really private personal information. So we didn't have this kind of product before, and we wanted to make sure that people knew the importance of it, that when they made one change across one this actual screen, all of their changes would be reflected across the entire ecosystem. So we went ahead and created a few screens, and on the left-hand side, you'll see the very first screen. And so manage what people see about you across all of Google. So we put this in front of participants, and as Seth had mentioned, the reason that we did this was in a conventional setting, it would have taken about even up to a year to create text that was revised and then reflected into product. But with the input of users from 7 participants per session over the course of maybe about a month or so, we were able to come up with at least a dozen iterations and really understand what users could gather from this. What could you do with the screen? So the first problem we saw was user comprehension. So people were like, okay, so people can see my information across google.com, the search engine? And we're like, no, this is not what we mean. So we went ahead and just kind of rev the text and we put it in front of participants. And so the very first thing that we did was we created this headline, control what people see about you. So being really able to frame the context of this screen in kind of this way really quickly that helped people immediately understand that they could go ahead and edit their information. And then to mitigate this idea that their changes would be shown up across google.com, the search engine, we wanted to list out the actual products. So Google services like Drive, Photos, Google+, and others were just itemized there so that people had kind of a more concrete notion of what would be going on. And so this is actually live on the site right now. And in the space of about a month, we were able to make these changes where conventionally, as I said, it would have taken about a year without these write studies. So across probably 8 or so apps, when Seth and I were working together, we went ahead and employed write studies, and it was just really, really eye-opening to see how quickly we can get feedback from users and really iterate on that text super fast. Hand it to a designer, have him pop that into the actual mock itself, and then have users tell us exactly what they understood. Can you close that for me? Thanks. Thanks. So the next methodology that we'll be talking about today is field studies, and Seth's going to tell you a little bit about that.
So just to add on to what Yvonne just said, was like I just want to call out two things. This kind of a study and this kind of an iteration wouldn't have been possible if I wouldn't have the pleasure of Yvonne sitting in the studies which I was conducting. Like everyone here thinks that they know English and they can write English and then they can like speak English and everything, which is fine, and we can. But when it comes to UX writing, I, as being a UX researcher, cannot claim myself being a UX writer. So and we'll talk about it more when we get to the field study example, but I don't have the ear to understand what people are saying in terms of vocabulary and what in terms of like their comprehension, in terms of comprehension. And being able to partner with a UX writer was such a big deal. And we were able, like she was able to sit in those studies and she's like, oh, people have the comprehension issue that they think that like they were searching for
right.
Google across Google, but it's not the case.
Yeah.
So that is where I really want to call out the fact that if you're doing studies and if you are a UX writer or a researcher, it's really important to collaborate, because you may, if being a UX researcher in this case, you may not have the skills to understand what a UX writer may be listening to. And on the other hand, being a UX writer, you really have to inform the UX research protocol and how the study is going to be conducted so that we are able to get the exact feedback we are trying to get. In this case, it was the text. So for example, if you are working on a text which you sort of have a hypothesis of, like you can like, this is sort of how we want to start, but we really don't know how the text is going to shape up. Write method is an excellent example which allows you to like sort of iterate rapidly and come up with a decision in a shorter amount of time as opposed to conducting a traditional usability study.
And so a small tweak here that I should have mentioned, I totally forgot, was manage versus control. So one might think, oh, those are just two synonyms, who cares? But actually, people felt a bigger sense of control when they saw the word control. I mean, it's their personal information, so you have to be really sensitive about how you speak about it, right? So people in marketing would really love the idea of managing, and it sounds softer and it sounds a little bit more like you've got a handle on things. But people who were actually noodling on these screens were like, well, I like the idea of control. I want the word control to be in there. And so that's feedback we wouldn't have gotten unless we put this through Write studies. So little things like that. Yes, is there a question?
Yeah, I have a question. So by UX text, do you just mean any text that's on the screen?
Exactly. Any text that's on the user interface.
Right, so labels or...
Labels, CTA buttons, like bullet points, yeah.
Great, thanks.
Absolutely.
Just to assume what you're, just to go on that, if you're trying to get feedback on that type of text, which is a label or which is a bullet point or something, the need to inform the research protocol becomes even more important, because then you're trying to get feedback on that specific line of text, and that is sort of how the protocol should be designed, so that you can get feedback on that text, because it is very easy for both the participants and the researchers to ignore that and not really understand whether that text was comprehensible or not. So if you're trying to get feedback on that, I would highly recommend partnering with research. Yes?
Do this work with an information architect as well?
So as a UX writer, that's part of my job as well, although we would love the luxury of having IA people to do that. But yeah, generally we'll advise on content strategy and IA.
As synonym ring and triples and stuff?
Exactly, yes.
Please repeat the question for the video.
Yes, so the question was if we worked with information architects at all. And so my response was that at Google, a lot of the UX writers are also content strategists that are also delve into IA.
Next method we're going to talk about are field studies. Have you? Yeah, field studies? Yes? Yeah, ethnographies? Oh, okay, awesome. So basically, field studies, I don't have a favorite method per se, but if I had an ideal UX researcher life, I would probably always be conducting field studies. And the reason for that is like, these are some of the studies where we get, as UX researchers, we are trying to get as unbiased of a feedback as possible, and this is one method where we are able to get we are able to move the spectrum towards less biased feedback than more biased feedback, as like in a right study, where the environment is more artificial than in a field study. So basically, in a field study, these are like in context visits, basically in a home or in an office or wherever that person is, and we're trying to understand basic product usage or just underlying behaviors and intentions and motivations and why people do what they do as they go about their daily life. So we conducted, we have conducted a variety of different types of field studies. Today, Yvonne is going to talk about how we partnered together on this one particular field study on Google+, and how we were able to understand text implications.
So when we set out to do field studies, well, first of all, I had a hard time trying to convince my boss that I should go. So he was like, why would you want to go to a research field study? And so it wasn't really conventional on our team to partner. And this is kind of like, because of all of this, like we were able to kind of make the case. But I remember saying, well, you know, it would be really wonderful to understand the vocabulary that people use when they're talking about our product in their actual setting. Really hearing what they say about, you know, when they bump into a screen that's really tricky, or an interaction that they find confusing, or something they find really delightful. Oftentimes, as a UX writer, I'm partnering with marketing, and marketing can have prose that sounds beautiful and lovely, but not really real. So I wanted to kind of get more of a concrete sense of what people were saying about our product. And so as a UX writer, I'm often in charge of trying to establish an entire voice and tone across a product. And so for Google+, we were kind of embarking on this new a new version of Google+. And before we did that, we wanted to understand first, what did people think about Google+? What were their sensibilities? Before we went on the field study, we had this internal tagline that we called G+ an interest-based sharing network. And so in all the meetings, we were like, yes, that sounds amazing. This is awesome. And so like for us, it sounded wonderful, but you know, more and more it became meaningless and trite. And so when we were actually going to these studies, and I often tell the story where we enter this gentleman's home and it was filled with the wonderful smell of blueberry scones. And he had every single Android figurine lined up on his mantle. And he had a chrome pillow on his couch. And I was like, wow, this is really where we need to be to conduct these studies. This is awesome. And so when we hear like such passion and people talking about G+, and also like some of the things they complained about, coming from their mouths and really trying to understand like the stories and different and unique ways they use G+ and what makes it valuable for them. We, across Atlanta and Chicago and all these wonderful cities, we heard that people wanted to find the sense of connection with others who shared kind of these topical interests. It's like, so people were passionate about like racing cars, and they wanted to connect with other people who had that same interest. So often these words like people, content, and conversations kept surfacing as these universal themes that connected people who were on G+. And so we thought, you know, using those words that people actually spoke, that kind of lexicon that was actually real and concrete, was super important. So when we went ahead and kind of did this whole marketing campaign across Google's new version, Google Plus's new version, we made sure that we used these specific terms in our marketing copy, so that we had this connective tissue between how we were describing this new version and how users were actually, you know, describing it themselves when they use the product. So for landing pages and promotional copy, and for like tweets and everything across the ecosystem of how we promoted Google+, we made sure to use this vocabulary. And again, people, content, and conversations kept surfacing. And then for us, we actually changed that internal tagline to reflect these words that users were talking about. People, content, and conversations.
So I just want to emphasize this one more time, that I were in those sessions and I were alone in these 3 cities talking to like 14 or 15 participants and understanding their perception. I wouldn't have been able to, or maybe like I would have, but I wouldn't have definitely been able to come up with this, the after thing. Because I, as a UX researcher, I'm not trained both from an education perspective and from a discipline perspective to understand what people are the type of vocabulary people are using, right? I'm there to understand people's behaviors and motivations. So having a UX writer in that room and trying to understand what types of words people use is a great asset for me in those kind of studies. In which case, like this collaboration becomes even more important. That I could have completely missed this feedback in those kinds of sessions, and we wouldn't have been able to come up with the insight we did if I did not have a UX writer in that room right at that time. So just to emphasize the importance, like if you're doing any type of research or any type of writing, like make sure that you are collaborating with the other discipline. Absolutely. Reaction cards. Have you heard about reaction cards, desirability? Yeah. Yes, awesome. So I was at Microsoft for 5.5 years and doing research on Windows. There was one researcher on that team who is still there, and she came up with this method called desirability reaction cards. At the end of the day, what this methodology does is that it tries to understand emotional reactions people have towards an experience. And those emotional reactions could be like frustrating and annoying and delightful and those kind of experiences. And what they did in this paper was that they came up with a list of 118 words which people use to describe an experience as they go through it. The reaction card exercise is the exercise where you as a product team go through, and there is a Wikipedia link too, you go through that 118 words and you pick up like maybe 20 or 25 which are relevant to your experience. And those 20 or 25 words should encompass positive and negative words. And so you take those words, print them out in a Word in a document, cut them out in a card, and after your participant has gone through an experience, you give them those cards and you say, hey, thank you for your time today. Please go through this list of words and make 2 piles. One which is relevant to your experience today, and one which is irrelevant to your experience today. So they are going through that pile and telling, oh, annoying, yes, it was irrelevant, and oh, exciting, no, it was not relevant. And after they are done with that exercise, you ask them, well, from the pile of relevant words, pick the 3 words which are most important or which stood out the most. And at that point, they really prioritize and they come up with 3 words. Those 3 words could be exciting, frustrating, and I don't know, like annoying or something, right? And at that time, that is the meat of the conversation when that starts. And then you ask them, like, tell me why you felt annoying. And then they'll tell him, like, oh, when I was going through that flow and the checkout flow was really annoying because I wasn't able to enter my credit card, blah, blah, blah. And then you ask them, hey, can you show me on the screen what felt annoying? So they'll show you on the screen, like, hey, when I was doing this, that felt annoying. So that is a really powerful research method because now you have a human emotion which is tied to a UI design, right? Like if you have annoying and how that ties into a visual design on the screen. So we use this method a lot in wherever it's relevant in a lot of studies we do, and we're going to talk about like how we use this method to rev on text in Google.
So as I mentioned earlier, Google Plus had kind of an overhaul. And so we had 4 main tabs that the users could go ahead and interact with. And so as Seth described the reaction cards, you want people, you would like people to kind of speak with positive attributes and say like, this is fresh and exciting and innovative. But that's not always the case, but it is generally super helpful when the words tend to be negative. So one of the words that kept on coming up when they saw these screens were confusing. So because we were like, so what could you do on this red tab that's called home? And people were like, well, I don't really know. And so, when they bounced from home to collections to communities to notifications, they didn't really understand or have a sense of the primary function of each screen. So we thought, we really need to be a little bit more explanatory in a lightweight manner. So we went ahead and created these inboarding kind of titles. So welcome home, and then underneath a subtitle that explains what the function of the screen is. So we went ahead and did that, tested that across several studies. And then users kind of gave us their input on what they found useful. And this is actually live in product now, and it's helpful because it gives them the understanding of what to do with each of these tabs, but also it doesn't get in the way because it's dismissible after they read it. So being able to identify, just using those reaction cards was super powerful because it helped us understand like, well, we need to figure out a way for users to interact with our product in an easier, lightweight manner. And being able to understand that it was confusing for them was kind of the first point in which we could use to revise this text. And we do this across all different types of text, but this inboarding text was particularly useful in that case.
So if you're sort of working on an experience where, so I try to, apart from the fact when I'm specifically trying to get emotional reactions and understand emotional reactions and track them over time on an experience, apart from that research goal. Sometimes I also adopt this research method when I have a hypothesis that this is kind of a weird area for people to give feedback on, and I'm not really confident if people are going to be able to have the vocabulary to give me feedback on this kind of stuff. So how do we give users the vocabulary to give us feedback like the one we want, right? So in this case, the reaction cards come in really handy, and please feel free to check it out on Wikipedia or something, that it provides them with the vocabulary so that they can express the feedback, which is sort of subconscious, and they're not, and so like I'm sure like you have been in studies where you have asked the participant, hey, how does it feel? And they go like, oh, it's okay. Right? Like, and they go like, and you really want that feedback, which they haven't, but you can't really have them like articulate that feedback. This kind of a methodology comes in really handy, in which you give them the vocabulary and they pick themselves in a completely unbiased way to give you more feedback on that. This was one particular situation where we were trying to understand the differences between the tabs, and we weren't really sure like why. Like, what is the difference? What is the problem going on? And comprehension was one big thing which came up as a result of that methodology, which Yvonne proposed, and so we were able to get feedback on that. Yes?
In a way, though, aren't you, with having preset cards, are you leading them to feel a certain way, or maybe preventing them from being able to express the sentiments that may not be depicted in the cards that you have?
So,
What was the question?
So the question is, if we give participants a preset list of cards, are we biasing them in some shape or form? Is that?
Yeah.
Okay. So I would say more no than yes. So I've been doing this for the like 7-8 years now, and I haven't seen any sort of bias in the response. There are two ways, like we're going like really deep into the method now, but I can talk about. So there are two most important things in how you actually execute the methodology. The first is, when you give the cards to the participants, you don't ask them to think through the cards. You say, hey, look at the cards, and with their first reaction, divide them into two piles. So when they look at annoying, they're not really thinking about, did they feel annoying or not? Like, they're like quickly doing that, number one. Number two, they are, when they come up with two piles, we ask them to prioritize based on the 3 most important cards which stood out, as opposed to having a conversation about the 10 things which they picked. So when they prioritize themselves, they come up with the most important ones which stood out. To be very honest, at the end of the day, the words they pick are not even important, unless you're trying to measure emotions over time or something. At the end of the day, if they pick annoying, sure, they picked annoying or frustrating, it doesn't matter. What matters is the conversation which happens as a result of them picking that word. So if they say frustrating, they're like, oh yeah, what is frustrating? And like, then you have a conversation about it, which is the meat of the feedback, and I'm sure like 90% of the time, that feedback is something which we haven't heard in the regular study session.
That's true. Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Surveys, I'm not going to, yes, please. Yeah, that's one of the concerns. I think if you really know how you're doing it and you have done it 10, 15 times, I think it'll take like 12 or 13 minutes, around 10 to 15 minutes, around that time. I'm not going to spend too much time on surveys because it's a well-known methodology, and Yvonne is going to talk about how we have used surveys to inform text.
So on Google+, we have something called a share box, which essentially is a way for users, prompting users to share a video or a text or anything. So we have 3 different platforms on Google+, and it was noticed that we have 3 different types of strings that prompt users to share. So engineers came up to me and they're like, hey, can you just pick a string and we'll put them on all 3 platforms? And I was like, I can, but why don't we go ahead and test and figure out which of the strings is most effective in having people share their content. But in order to do that, I went ahead and did a competitive analysis of other social networks and tried to understand the types of structure and content of these social sharing text strings. And then finally thought through different types of variations that made sense for Google+. And then I went ahead and did a consumer survey on Google across like a few weeks and 7,000 responses, and whittled down the top 3 choices But we didn't stop there. We went ahead and did an A/B experiment on the two highest performing variations. And I don't know if you want to talk real quick about. So we went ahead and, I don't know if any of you are familiar with A/B experiments. So it's when you test two competing types of components that are typically sit in the same type of UI, so that you understand which gathers a better click-through or just better performance. So we went ahead and did, on our desktop version, we went ahead and compared two different types of text over the course of a month. And what we found was that What's New With You kind of compelled users to share more video, text, and images through Google+. And so what was important about this was that we could find data points to go ahead and validate or hypotheses on different types of UX text that would be more compelling to users, rather than just going ahead and picking one. Yes?
Did you have any localized versions of this? I was just thinking that that's kind of an idiom, so I would wonder if localization came into this, or if this was just with the English.
No, that's a really good question. No, we just did this for the English markets. And the question was about localization. Yes?
So you said that you did a competitive scrape, and then you did a survey to determine the top 3 of the competitive, like the
No.
you found in your
So essentially I did a competitive scrape, and then I went ahead and did like 10 or so variations. And then I went ahead and tested those on Google Consumer Surveys, found the top 3, and then
A/B tested those.
A/B tested the top 2.
How did you determine the top 2 out of the 3 that you found?
From the Google Consumer Surveys.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So the highest performing.
Exactly.
The other thing was that there is a lot of like material design compliance we have to do.
Right. So we have a lot of different types of standards that we have to kind of adhere to. So we do have latitude in terms of trying to determine what types of strings, but there are certain rules that we have to adhere to. Yeah.
For like length and
For length and for,
ability.
yes, exactly. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, so when you were doing the A/B testing, how did you quantify like which one worked better? Like what was your method?
So, yeah, exactly. So, no, that's a good question. How did we quantify higher performing text versus non? So we went ahead and measured how many instances people shared with the actual type of text. So we did an experiment on, for instance, What's New With You? How many people of like 9,000 respondents would go ahead and share a piece of text or a video or an image versus another type of string. So we attached the click-through rate to the actual string.
I was just curious, was this in production and just random?
Yeah, actually, we did about 1% of users across the span of 1 month on desktop. Yes. Yes.
So you probably have a lot of KPIs on that page, right? So let's say you're trying to find something that'll make people share the most, but you also look at the other KPIs, like, oh, well, they're sharing more, but they're also spending like 10% less time on the page, right? So how do you, it's hard to have multiple goals when you're A/B testing, but you kind of have to look at all those things, right?
No, that's a really, really good point. But for this, we just confined it to the actual text box itself. Yeah.
Did you find there was any difference between mobile and in terms of the rates of success?
That's a good point. No, that's a good question. Then the question was differences between language in mobile and desktop. So we only used we tested the 3 versions across all platforms, and then we tested the highest performing text on desktop only. So we didn't go that deep in terms of mobile versus desktop.
There were also some constraints around the ability to set up experiments on mobile and how fast we can do that. The other thing is there was a foundational study done before this in terms of what are the motivations of human beings and why do they want to share in social media. And so we were when we were coming up with these hypotheses, a lot of those hypotheses and a lot of the text variations were being guided from what are the motivations to share just in general across social media sites. And we were pretty confident based on that data that when people share, regardless of which form factor they're using, whether it's laptop, desktop, mobile, or tablet, the intention and the motivations they're trying to share with are sort of the same at the end of the day. The last one we are going to talk about is heuristic evaluation. Have you heard about Heuristic evaluations? Yes, awesome. So it's a really amazing tool, and it's basically a method for finding usability problems in a UI or in a flow per se, to come up with basically, yeah, as I was saying, to come up with usability problems. The reason this method stands out from the rest of the methods we just talked about is because if you have gone through the process and if you have read the paper and you really understand the process, this is something you can do on your own with a group of people, even though if you don't have a UX researcher at your disposal at that point of time. So basically what heuristic evaluation talks about is 10 heuristics which a user interface design should follow to be able to be what we call usable. I'll just give you one quick example. The first one is visibility of system status. What that says is at any point of time when a human being is interacting with the system should also always tell the user what the state of the system is. And I'll just leave it at that. So for example, if you've pressed a button, then the interface should tell you that the button was pressed and we are processing, right? So that system state should always be conveyed to the user. You can go through these 10 heuristics from a user interface perspective and come up with usability problems and see where your design is failing versus not failing. So what Yvonne did was, like, if you read online that there is a lot of application of heuristic evaluation in coming up with usability problems in visual design, there hasn't been a lot of work done in applying this to text. And we're going to talk about an example of how we applied this to text.
Yeah, and I want to go back to this just for a brief moment, because there's all these heuristics that essentially are a report card for deeming something as usable. And so oftentimes you'll get bugs or whatever as a writer, and there are different components that don't adhere to any of these heuristics. So it's just a really easy way to catch things. For instance, if just yesterday I got a modal that didn't have a dismiss button or an X. So that just essentially violates number 3, user control and freedom. So how is the user supposed to have this escape hatch to get out of the modal, right? So things that are super easy and lightweight are just easily identifiable through just kind of following through these heuristics. And as Seth mentioned, if you don't have a researcher on staff, this is just a really great way to get your team involved in trying to understand, first of all, like what the heuristics are of a good usable experience, and then really making sure that everybody kind of is up for that polish and product excellence. So this is just a super simple example of a G+ collection. And so you'll see that the title of the collection is called Yet Another Collection, and underneath has a status visibility indicator of only you. But right underneath that, it says your collection is now visible. So these two strings are competing essentially in terms of visibility. And so that's one thing that's like easy to catch and identify and to fix. So going through every single experience in the screen to screen for all the critical user journeys in your products is it's super easy to find these flaws and then go ahead and address them through text. And what I found super surprising was that because people apply these heuristics to visuals only, this was just a really great way for my writing team to get involved in understanding interactions more and really just making sure that they had higher quality text in all the experiences that we were crafting.
We're almost out of time, so I'm going to rush through the last couple of slides. But if you are a UX writer, or if you are a part of the product team and you want feedback on text or any other visual design, like this is an excellent research method which you can adopt and like go through with your team members and come up with basic usability problems without having a UX researcher at your disposal. So feel free to read about this online too. So these are sort of the 6 methods we have used so far in informing text and making it more sort of user-informed and more objective. And it has been super successful. We are still partnering and coming up with new and different types of ways in which we can make text more objective and more user-informed, and this was just one example of like how we have used all these different methods in our experience. And at the end of the day, like the most important thing which I want to convey today, and we want to convey today, is like if you're not including people in the process of product development and not getting their feedback throughout the product development phase, like all we are shipping at the end of the day is opinions and assumptions which you and your product team and your PMs and your designers are coming up with, and it doesn't matter what we think, because what actually matters is what our users think. So make sure you're incorporating users in the product development phase and making it a truly user-centered design process. Thank you.
I was going to say something else. Does anybody have any other questions that we could address?
Please.
I just have a comment.
So the question was if Google was moving away from the conventional Nielsen heuristics and kind of trying to create new heuristics for other types of interactions. And I have a quick answer to that one. So I'm working on a lot of Google Assistant related products, and with that comes the idea of third-party bots. And so I was able to kind of use this as a template and kind of a map to understand how bot interactions are different and create heuristics for those. And so we're kind of socializing that in our communities right now in UX, and trying to understand how we might be able to apply these best practices across all of our products that use virtual assistants. So the question was if Seth has ever done reaction cards remotely or just in person.
I've done it twice with remote participants, and it didn't go as planned. But there is a way in which you can do it. The way is that if you have a slide, Google Slides or PowerPoint or something, what I have tried to do is that instead of cutting out words in a paper sheet, I have pasted the words on the slide in a really big font or something, and then we go through the words together with the remote participant, and it's not as natural, but I asked the participant, hey, take 5 minutes of your time, or not 5 minutes, take some of this time and like go through the words and write down on your own the words which feel relevant. And so they're like typing on their end. That sort of goes on fine, but the thing which goes on really good is like when I ask them to then prioritize the word and come up with the top 3 ones, that goes on fine. When all the words are listed on the slide, that is sort of like a lot of text on the slide, and people are like really sometimes disoriented. So it's not really an efficient way, but you can definitely do it, and I haven't seen any like type of feedback changing because I'm doing it remotely. It just takes more time, I think. Yes, please. So the question is, do we share our research findings with the rest of the Google family, and how do we do it? Is that? Yeah. So yes, we do. It's a very open and collaborative and very transparent culture at Google. If I am working on, currently I'm working on the Google Search and Google Maps space, and I have some research which, I don't know, like YouTube is doing or something, then it's a very open community where we can partner and we can share our results, and we can, instead of reinventing the wheel, we always like share and collaborate in that sense. Yeah, does that?
In the archive.
And there's also a central archive, as Yvonne just pointed out, where we all share our research findings. So for example, if I'm interested in understanding, has anyone used a diary study to do blah, I can go to that website and I can search and see if there are relevant reports on that. Yes.
Yeah,
So the question is like, what kind of advice can we give to UX writers to focus more on research? Is that?
No, UX designers.
Designers.
Because we don't have the writers, we don't have resources for the writers. So we ask the designers to take care of it, but designers say we don't have time, we don't have resources.
Oh, so they come up with their text, which is their own thinking.
Right. So
yeah.
It could be subjective. It could be too much personality.
I'm going to try to hold myself back and say that is a travesty, and that you need writers.
Yes.
It's an entire discipline and craft that we are experts at, and so it is oftentimes kind of a battle to fight when eng or designers create their own text, because we've spent decades trying to really understand language and how people interact with it and how it's going to interact in your product. So it's difficult, yes, when you don't have writers, maybe contract writers or something like that, but I definitely think that the discipline should be there for your product, so that...
Are you a researcher or designer or...?
I'm both. I manage a team.
Oh, you manage a team.
Yeah.
So I would like put it back at you, and like let's imagine that if you didn't have designers and you had writers, would you ask writers to start designing?
I can't do mocks, so I wouldn't do it for you. Yes.
Time.
Oh, okay, sorry.
We're out of time, but thank you so much. We are happy to chat.
Thank you so
outside.
much.
Yes.